Hello, everyone. I'm Joyce Chachu Hilton, the Africa Community Manager at Climate Tracker, and I just want to invite you all to the third edition of our Africa Community Hangout. Today, we have amazing speakers with us who are going to be taking us through a very relevant topic, which is on building a climate resilient Africa. Before we get into it, I just want to let you all know that this event is a live event. So if you want to join in, we are doing a live tweet on Twitter. So if you want to join in the conversation, just tag us at climate tracking and use the hashtag community hangout to join in on the conversation. So we're just going to get started. So we have three amazing speakers with us, and we're going to start with one of them, which is Ramadia. And today, I'm excited to let you know that we have speakers that have, incredible insight on the topic that we are going to be discussing. So first off, we're starting with Ramadia, and I'm going to give a brief intro into what she does and who she is and why she's a very relevant speaker on this community hangout today. So Ramadia is a climate journalist from Egypt, and she's a media trainer as well. She's the founder of the Climate School Initiative and the winner of Covering Climate Now's Emerging Journalist Award 2021. She's collaborated with several Arab and foreign media, and she was also one of Climate Tracker's first media mentorship fellows and reported on COP26 through Climate Tracker's COP26 Climate Justice Journalism Fellowship. Today, she will be presenting on how to identify and tell stories of indigenous and community-based climate adaptation techniques. So Rama, the floor is all yours. We can't wait to hear all the amazing insights you have for us.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from Egypt. I'm really happy to be with you today. Thanks for having me. And I'm really honored to be with the incredible panel today. As Joyce said, I'm supposed to talk to you about how can we identify and tell stories about climate adaptation stories. And let's start. I want to talk at first about how can we, the first part of my speech is how to identify the stories. And for me, there are two ways to identify climate adaptation stories. I'll talk to you later about how to tell the story, but first of all, how can we find the story? So the first way is to start with the problem and then search for the adaptation technique for it. For example, when agriculture crops are damaged in an area of your community as a result of extreme heat waves, the problem here could be the one that directs you to search for solutions and initiatives to adapt to this problem and to learn about all the initiatives and projects related to climate smart agriculture. So this is just an example that can apply with all problems resulting from climate change, such as coral bleaching, loss of job opportunities, drop of education, and other problems resulting from climate change. And then the next step is to look for techniques that already exist to adapt to this problem. The second way to identify the story is to start by searching for official and unofficial projects and initiatives related to climate change adaptations in your country or your region. And you can find them on websites of ministries and official bodies concerned with environmental and climate change affairs, local and international organizations and associations, youth initiatives, and activist pages, scientific research sites, and so on. These resources could help you to find your story. And I'll send you some of the resources that helped me a lot in my work. I excluded the local the local sites from them, and Joyce will share them with you after they hang out. And I want to give you an example of the second way. For example, an initiative or a campaign such as a CAMFIT campaign, and it's a campaign for girls' education, which started in African countries that were exposed to extreme weather events. led to girls dropping out of education, and Campus campaign offered them grants to continue their education to help them build resilience with climate change and use their education as a weapon against the climate change and creating adaptation solutions. After I read about the Campus campaign, I interviewed three African leaders in the field of climate adaptation about how their access to education has helped them to build resilience to climate change in their countries and adapt to drought, water shortage, erosion of cities led to job losses and other consequences of climate change. Another story I started from the Great Green Wall project, which aims to provide millions of job opportunities and cultivate millions of hectares to resist the drought and desertification and job losses as a result of climate change in Africa. After attending an online session on the COP26 showing a movie about this project. Besides the international events like the COP, you can also find the story from the official plans. For example, after Egypt announced its national strategy for climate change in 2050, I make a story about the plans it includes for adaptation and resistance building. And to summarize above, you can start from the problem and search for the adaptation techniques that already exist to it, or starting from the official and official projects and initiatives for adaptation, and then find the right story you can tell about these projects. This is the first part of the speech, and the second part is how to tell the story. You can hear some tips I would love to share with you from my experience in covering adaptation stories about how can we tell stories on climate change and climate adaptation in an engaging way and find the perfect angle to tell our story. I want if Joyce can share a screen with us about the one of the article I wrote to Climate Tracker about Egypt farmers and how they face climate impact with a new agriculture methods. The most important thing for me in telling any climate stories is the human side, because people are more interested in human stories than numbers and studies. So you should always start your stories with this interesting aspect to attract their attention. And this story, as you see, the story begins with a quote from a farmer who doesn't know much about climate change, but he knows that his crop every year, he knows that his crops are damaged every year at this time due to heat waves. And he talked to us about how his losses and how they affected his life and his family. I decided to begin the story with this farmer to grab the reader's attention. And after you grab the attention of the reader, you will gain his sympathy. And after this, you can explain to him the reason why that happened and support your text with studies and numbers. But an important thing you have to keep in mind when you're referring to numbers is always better to rely on data visualization, such as pictures, maps, infographics, because as important as the numbers are, they can be boring for the reader, especially when you have a lot of them to show. Another important thing when you tell a climate story or climate adaptation story, don't use difficult or specialized terms without explaining and simplifying them. Always remember that you are not writing a research paper, but you are talking to a non-specialist person. So speak to him in a language he can understand. And always be careful to document and refer to the sources of the number you showed and where and when the studies and reports you were published for more credibility. Another important thing in adaptation stories, which are classified as solution journalism, don't go too far in explaining the problem and its causes. The greatest focus in adaptation stories and any solution journalism story should focus should be on explaining adaptation techniques, how to apply them on the ground, and what this requires, and discuss this question with experts, researchers, and stakeholders. Finally, you can close the story with an optimistic quote, a sentence that explains the next step or what is needed in order for these adaptation techniques to be applied. And to summarize the above, the hero in the story always the human side. Use simple language and explain any specialized term. Use photos, videos, maps, and infograph when you deal with numbers. Focus on explaining adaptation techniques more than explaining problem, its causes, and consequences. And that's all I want to share with you today, but I'm here for any question or discussion. And thanks again for having me today.
Thank you so much, Ramadia, for this very insightful speech on how to tell these climate adaptation stories. And I think that's what you said is very insightful, because sometimes when these stories are reported, they are reported in a way that sounds so complicated. So the average person or the average man is not able to understand. And then at the end of the day, the whole purpose of reporting on the story is defeated. So thank you so much again, Ramadia, for that. And at the end of the community hangout, if we have any questions that are addressed to you, I will let you know so that you can respond to them. Okay, so moving on to okay, so moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Anderson Kabila. And Mr. Anderson has 16 years of experience in climate and energy policy research, energy systems modeling, sectorial decarbonization, sustainable agriculture and forest management, market and value chain analysis, as well as innovation and entrepreneurship. He has written 50 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and professional reports on these thematic areas of research. Today, he will be presenting on the topic of accelerating climate actions through science policy practice partnership. So, Mr. Anderson, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I just want to reiterate that I am working with the Stockholm Environment Institute based in Nairobi, Kenya. So Stockholm Environment Institute is a research and policy organization that deals conduct research mostly on the environment and development. So we seek solutions on how to bridge science and policy. So in today's presentation, which I will share my slides shortly, I just want to give you one of the work that I've done in relation to, how you can bridge all the science that we do into policy, as well as translating those policies into practice. I hope you can see my screen. Okay, so this is a framework that I developed on the, bridging science and policy, which starts basically with highlight a model, as you can see on the left-hand side of the of the screen to you, the right-hand side. So you see here, the model actually take into consideration the political strategy, the policies that the government is proposing, the institutions, how can you transform the institution to be much more effective, as well as the finances that are required in order to implement those policies. Most often than not, we see that most policy scholars focus mostly on the two quadrants at the bottom of the figure, which is how can they try to innovate policy to make them much more effective, as well as institutions. But they fail to talk more about the politics that affect policies and the different government institutions, as well as the financial strategy, to implement those policies. So at times it's quite, that's why most of the policies, they are just there when they are developed, they find them just at the shelves with very few, of those policies actually being translated into practice. So there's a need to actually make sure that you bridge the political strategy, align it with the policies, as well as the financial strategy, aligning it with the institutions to ensure effective implementation of, of the different national action plans that have been developed. So this framework actually integrates, mass media, as you can see here. The mass media multimedia analysis take into consideration the different aspects of politics in terms of who are the policy actors, how are they formed in terms of coalitions, what are the power balance, in this with these policy actors, the leadership direction, their core beliefs and preferences, and more importantly, brokerage levers. So people who are, in there to try to make sure that both parties, come to some sort of an agreement in order to move forward, to put forward and move certain agendas forward. So as you can see, most of these political issues actually go in contrary the different policies that you have, that the government themselves have actually adopted or have signed in terms of international treaties. This is not quite strange. It is quite normal in many circumstances, not only in Africa, but also in Europe and North America, because, politicians always, put in place policies based on how favorable they are to their constituencies. So you cannot bring along a policy that is not electable, or else those politicians will be voted out. And some of these policies that they actually put forward, especially during election times, most of them are even like contrary to what is in the policies that they themselves have signed or, have put forward. So there's always that need to make sure that the political strategy actually aligns with the different policies that they have, that have been proposed by the government, and what definitely are the trade-offs and synergies between among those policies. And it's also quite important to also ensure that, there's enough finances to implement the policies, which of course is a critical issue, because without funding, the policies will never be implemented. So once the policies are being developed, the policy scholars, the academics, policymakers, policy planners who are involved in developing those policies should ensure that they do some stuff, cost and benefit analysis of the different measures. What are the financial costs of the different measures, the indirect cost, the opportunity cost, and the macroeconomic cost? Because all these elements are quite critical in ensuring that, there's effective implementation of the different policy measures that are being proposed by the government. And last but not least, the institution also play a critical role, because without well-functioning institutions, those policies will not be properly implemented. And the forces that actually shape institutional innovation are definitely as you can see here, the transformational leadership. And this transformational leadership should actually involve different stakeholders across different sectors and across different institutions. Most often than not, in government institutions, the leadership are just headed by, people that have been nominated or appointed by the government in those key ministries. But as you may know, scholars or people who will provide evidence, they are not their main outcome of the research are definitely not like integrated into most of this, decision making, the different ministries. So it's quite critical that you have a technical committee that, do all this research, come out with policy recommendations, and see how we can mainstream those recommendations into national action planning for effective implementation. So this is quite critical in terms of, the culture of the leadership. How well are the different ministries or different sectors collaborating? As you can see, definitely one policy in one ministry or in one sector would definitely have a positive or negative impact on another sector. So there should be, seamless collaboration between the ministries. And there's also, it's quite critical to ensure that, you have this digital space to ensure transformative action. As now currently we are now moving to from paperwork to digitalizing most of our policies or actions that we take. So it's quite critical that governments, especially African governments, move into this transition. So that's just an overview of this framework, and at the core of it, what is quite very important is, this machine-driven user interface that is quite important to implement these policies through an online application, whereby government officials who are not that, who are not quite effective in doing modeling, we, the modelers, the researchers, we do all the modeling at the back door, and then provide policymakers with a very user-friendly interface where they can actually go in there, have a lot of scenarios to guide them on how to plan in their different sectors. And this user interface would definitely constitute of, satellite imagery, data from the satellite sources, and others, all sorts of data that have been, combined into a database to actually affect, some of these scenarios to guide policymakers in terms of planning. So the key issue here is to ensure that, this machine-driven interface allows for some sort of a seamless integration of new scientific findings into existing and new policies. Since it is now digital, it will enable, the fact that any new findings that we get, we can simply just upload it into the database. So to enable, policymakers to have, the information on time to actually guide their planning, rather than wait where after 4 or 5 years you start going back to the policy documents that have been there on the shelf, see how you can start updating them. But once it is digital, any new information can be fed into the system for automatic update. And this allows for seamless integration of existing policies to adapt to new realities and response to changing environment. So it's quite critical for, as we all know, the issue of climate change is evolving, changing. So it is always a need that as issues change, we come up with new solutions, and these new solutions are actually provided seamlessly and on time to policymakers to affect certain decisions. So what I did was I used this framework and applied it to the Kenyan context. And what I did was just to use one of the quadrant, which was talking about multi-criteria decision analysis, and see how most of the land use policy.
Hello, Anderson, I think you are muted. Okay.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so this is an index that I developed, and it constitutes of so many, major indicators. So you have the policy support indicator, the governance index, social safeguards, environmental safeguards, social economic safeguards, economic evaluation, as well as monitoring and evaluation. So under these major indicators, you have several sub-indicators that were used, but I've summed up all the results of the sub-indicators to the major ones. So here you can see that in terms of the coding, the green color provide high coherence among the different policies. And the policies that I'm talking about in Kenya is the agricultural transformation strategy, the national forest plan, the national water management plan, the national energy plan, the national climate change action plan. So these are the key policies that I analyze, taking into consideration these key climate compatible development indices. So yeah, just to give like a highlight of the analysis for those who are not quite technical, so that with the colors you can easily see how the policies are actually faring one another. The green color shows that the policies are highly coherent. The light green, they are high coherent. The yellow shows partial coherence. The orange, low coherency, and the red, yeah, is quite low. So in essence, the red shows that the policies are performing poorly, and the very green shows that they're performing very well. So you can see on this chart, none of the policies are actually performing quite good in terms of these different indicators or indices that are used for the assessment. So it's quite important that the government of Kenya look into this and then see measures on how to improve on this policy. So what I did then was to take all these policies and put them on the map, again, to guide policymakers on where most of these policies lie on this map and how they could be improved to enhance coherency. So as you can see, the red quadrant here shows most of the policies that are not that effective and very low coherence. All of them actually need immediate attention for improvement to ensure that you put in place measures to move them either to the green quadrant, where you actually make them very, very effective or coherent among each other, thereby reducing trade-offs and conflicts while improving synergies amongst them. Then the yellow quadrant, as I mentioned earlier, highlights partial policy coherence. And there's also means for immediate improvements to take, most of the policy measures again into the green quadrant. Then for the green quadrant, as you can see here at the top right-hand corner, that those are policies that have very high coherence among each other, and there are very few of them. As a matter of fact, the very high coherence policy are just about 3. The coherent policies are 4 of them. So those ones, there's no need for action because they are performing very well. So the key here is just to highlight, the different policies where they fall on this quadrant, and to show policymakers exactly how those policies are faring with one another, and measures to actually improve them. So it's quite important that while we analyze these policies, we put into consideration this index that have these indicators to actually show the performance of these policies and how to go about improving them to ensure, effective implementation, and, ensure that we actually are moving towards the path towards sustainable development in terms of Agenda 2030 and the AU Agenda 2063. So I will stop there, and if there's any questions, then I'll be more than happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anderson, for such an insightful presentation on policy. One of the questions that I wanted to ask was that you have shared a very detailed quadrant on policies and where they are faring on the mapping that you just showed to us. So the question I wanted to find out was that as journalists, if we are made known that these are the shortfalls of these kind of policies, what advice would you give to a journalist on the way forward? Like, how do they take this up and make a difference?
Yes, for journalists, we researchers, what we do is just to provide, the evidence. Now it's not left for either journalists, which of course you people do advocacy, to take the evidence and see how you can use your various channels, either the traditional channels like TV, radio, or other social media outlets like Twitter and all the like, and take, first of all, the very work with these other scientists, take the technical information and see how you can translate them into very simple language that could be understood by the policymakers as well as general public. Because most often than not, is a weakness, which I can say that many scientists don't know how to communicate, their findings in very simple terms, because we've been trained just to do that, to analyze and report on our findings. So it's now important and critical that journalists take these findings and see how you can now, translate them into very simple language that could be understood by the public and those who actually make decisions, either at higher level or at the community level. So I believe that's how journalists, can play a critical role in ensuring that, what we do is actually mainstream into national action planning.
Thank you so much, Addison. And I think that what you just said is very important, that as researchers, you have to find the findings and all the important details to let people know that, okay, these policies are not working. But then as journalists, our job is to magnify them and to let the public know that, okay, these are not working. So what do we do and how do we go forward from here? So thank you so much, Anderson. And we're moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Gregory Akal. So Gregory has 15 years of professional working experience in research, climate communication, international development, humanitarian assistance, and media in sub-Saharan Africa. Gregory's current work explores climate change adaptation resilience, pastoralism, farmer-led irrigation development, climate-induced displacement, and forced migration common pool, resources, sustainability, and climate communication in Africa's drylands. Akal is also an award-winning international journalist, and he will be taking us through the role of community journalists in amplifying alternative voices of climate solutions or stories. And he will also touch a bit on mainstreaming these local interventions in Africa. So Gregory, the floor is all yours, and we cannot wait to learn from you today.
Oh, great. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Anderson, Rama, and all the Climate Tracker staff who have given us this opportunity to share our experience. Okay, as it has been spoken, actually, it's good that Anderson just concluded his presentation on the issue about policy coherence. And as you can see from what he's just mentioned, that there is a very low policy coherence in most of the sectors that fall under the climate action things. So mine is just basically to share, okay, as I don't need to introduce myself again. I'm Gregory Akal, originally from northwestern Kenya, in a place called Turkana. Turkana is one of those regions in Kenya which for more than 6 decades have seen or have experienced the vagaries of disruptive climate events, mainly droughts. So they faced more than 35 droughts. But as from the media, for many years, that region has been known for drought, the images of drought, the images of conflict arising from resource-based conflicts, that is were predominantly inhabited by pastoralists or livestock keepers who rely mainly on livestock because their area is very arid. It's an arid area, which is almost 80% of it's arid. And coincidentally, most of the communities living on the front line of climate change live in the northern territories of their countries in Africa. If I'm not wrong, in most of the places, if you go to Uganda, the same. In Ghana, they live in the north, in Nigeria, in the north. So I don't know why it's all that kind of, the northern territories are. So since the 60s, actually since post-independence, and since all these scientific theories about the tragedy of the commons, the issues of desertification in the 70s, when they say that because these people were keeping livestock, they are degrading the environment. So those kind of global narratives have continued to be reproduced until this 21st century. So as the media people, maybe I'll just say that I have a background in journalism, and out of my interest to understand why this region has always been affected by drought, I decided to go and do research on the same to make me understand the same issues. And it's really it's good as a journalist personally to know how to bring out this issue. And for the past 10 plus years, I've been involved in climate activism. And if I can tell you, our African sisters and brothers, climate change was least understood even in the developed countries. For example, in the UK, in 2008, I used to do campaigns for Oxfam to kind of highlight some of the challenges, the impact of climate change on communities in the developing countries. I can say after 10 years, from 2008 is when a number of people in the developed world, including the US, the UK, have started to appreciate the impacts, the global interdependency of the disruptive climate events, which most of these communities have least contributed to. But they are the ones being on the front lines because of lack of capacity, because of lack of finance to adapt, to respond to some of these effects. But going back to Rama's conversation about the adaptation techniques, in 2014, while I was doing my fieldwork in Turkana County, while at the University of Cambridge, I found out there was a lot of, there was a gap and misinformation about some of the issues. There were some very good things happening in that area, but the mainstream media kept always, they're obsessed with politics. And of course, these areas are almost over 1,000 kilometers from the capitals. So they rarely get coverage of events happening on the ground. And the most funny thing about that is the local communities, the indigenous groups, are more knowledgeable about the environment because some of them have lived in those environments for over 2,000 years. And they've also faced the same disruptive climate events like drought, floods. In some areas like in Lesotho, you will find there's a lot of soil erosion. The kingdom of Lesotho is much more mountainous and it has a very small land for cultivation of agricultural produce. I have a participant from Lesotho in this community hangout. I was there sometime back in 2011 doing stuff on climate change. And many times the mainstream media ignores the knowledge, not even the mainstream media alone, even the scientists, the researchers like ourselves. Just because you went to school in some very good place, you think those local people are not knowledgeable about certain things. So you find out that despite the fact they have the knowledge in those areas, whether it is in Egypt, in Sudan, in Liberia, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, now we have floods. There is all this mentality of flying journalist. The flying journalist, they'll come to breaking news, the CNN effects, like 24 hours reporting. You just want to scoop the other media house. So mainly to come and report about the drought. But we are now past talking about the problems of climate change, because climate change is a word which just got coined around 2006 is when the world started using all this narrative of climate change. And then now in the 21st century, just a few years ago, they use a term called resilience. Resilience now, everyone is running with the word resilience. So I started a community journalist, it was called a citizen journalist, just trying to work with some local journalists who are from that area, who understand the area, to tell their own stories in their own way. And also some of the experts who are from that local area, either who have a background in environment, in education, in food security, in conservation. And they've really been able to tell those stories using the platform, because we did like a monthly newspaper while I was also back in school and doing the same. And it really tried to set an agenda, as a media, as an alternative media, setting an agenda to the mainstream media to start telling stories that are more development oriented, because community journalists are always there with those people. And as we talk about this climate change discourse, the global climate change discourse, which is really been taking a big, it's a center stage. I think communities who are affected directly by droughts, by floods, by now the locust, and recently the COVID-19 pandemic, should be in the center of the climate action. As we talk about the Sustainable Development Goal 13, that's on climate action, taking urgent action against climate change. So the community journalists are the one who can be the right people to amplify the voices of those vulnerable groups like women, children, the youth, the elderly, and the disabled, who have no access. Because as climate change is an issue, it's a political issue, and it's also an ethical issue. And it requires a lot of, these people need to be on the table. They don't need to be on the menu. So many times in the international conversation on these issues of climate adaptation or issues about climate solution issues, many of these conversations happen in the capital cities of the world, discussing about those people who have been affected. I'll be there in my suit. Maybe I live in Nairobi. Just go attend the COP26, or I attend the next COP in Egypt in my suit. So as you know, like what Anderson was just presenting about the policy incoherence, the very low policy incoherence, because those people who make policies are not the same who implement those policies on the ground. So sometime last October, I decided just to relaunch this as a website to focus mainly on climate solutions. So I traveled down to Turkana to find out some of the civil society organizations, the subnational governments, what they are doing on the same. Because online you will read all these very nice policies, all these very good, well-funded projects, but the conversations are just happening in the hotels, in the 5-star hotels. They're just flying. Whenever like there is a drought, people come in, they say, okay, we have an appeal for food. But we are talking for are not involved. So the voices of those affected. So this is a climate justice issue. It's a human rights issue, because climate change, this climate emergency is a climate crisis, which is affecting the food systems of these communities who rely on farming, on agricultural crop farming, and also livestock keeping. So there are many indigenous, they have an indigenous knowledge that they've practiced for many years. Like now, land is an issue for most of the communities who keep livestock, because they have a traditional way of mobility in a sense that they move from one place to another. So they need like a big span of land for them to kind of keep their livestock, which are their economic assets, so that they can adapt and respond to these disruptive climate events. So maybe I now go to the next point about how will Africa mainstream climate resilience. One of the recommendation is there should be a more inclusive conversation on issues about climate action, involving the local communities who are directly affected by this climate crisis. Because most of those who say they are speaking for them are basically gatekeepers. Because it's also a business. It's now becoming a business, because you still have to keep the problem so that you continue getting funding. And also we've got into this problem of sucking into the global narratives. We do not understand more about them. We just talk of climate adaptation, resilience, I don't know. All this, they don't really mean much. On the ground, the reality on the ground is quite different. I'm sorry, I'll talk to that because I'm putting on different hats as a journalist, as a researcher, as an activist, in terms of, because one of the things that inspired me to become a journalist was a drought. My family lost almost 1,000 heads of cattle because of the drought. Today you are rich, 24 hours later you're poor. So as journalists who are in those areas, the community journalists, I call them community journalists there because they are there. They are just a phone call away. And the way I kind of mentor some of these people is just tell them that you get out of your comfort zone, go to those farmers who are doing farming along the rivers, or to those people who have livestock, who are now trying to survive, to kind of adapt to the changing climate and tell the story from their eyes, the way Rama just shared before in our talk. So as much as we are so much, we romanticize numbers, figures and numbers, and also reports from, yeah, there are so many reports, there are so many researches that have been done, even like in Turkana, you know, the first people to do it. But the implementation, as I said, because those ones who are making policies in the capital cities for the government, they are there to protect the interest of the current government. So they are not there to protect the interest of those directly affected by climate change. So one of the techniques that maybe I can add on what Rama had mentioned before is their oral history. Most of these communities, in every part of Africa, communities have their own traditional way of telling different events. They have like a calendar of events. Like this year, they've named it 2020. In some communities like the Turkana, they say the year of locust, the invasion of locust, and also the year of COVID. So there is remembering major events. So they have a calendar of events. So as a journalist, those are some of the things that can give you background information, the history, because the communities have a lived experience of what has been happening. Climate change is not new to them. They've lived with it. Like for the Turkana, they've lived with it for like a century. They've experienced drought since 1924. So what has been done different is really what we now need to change the conversation to the solutions done by those communities, not PR stories for some local organization or for the civil society groups or for some bilateral partners to get funding. So strangely, when we went on the ground and trying to access some of the partners, they were not able to show us some of the solutions, climate solutions, what they have been doing on the ground. And even my research before, almost 8 years ago, clearly revealed that it is just a talk show. The people are just drawing international funding, saying they're involved in climate change work, climate adaptation work, they are doing resilience programming, all these big words, which I think journalists will not understand exactly. So because for journalists, we need facts. We want to see what's happening. Some impactful communication, like what is changing? How is the lives of these people changing? So back to how do we mainstream climate resilience in Africa is one, the issue of involving local communities who are affected by this, and also engaging the media, the local media. Of course, the media houses have their own interests. Those are businesses. They are doing it because they have to get adverts to sustain their business. So most of the stories about climate change climate solution might not really get the headlines. The only thing that will get the headlines is the problem. But as journalists, we need to look at, we already know the problem of some of the areas where we work. We now need to see, okay, so-and-so is claiming they are doing a project on this. So can you take us there? Okay, another issue also sometimes is issues about budgets. Budgets for the journalists. Many media houses don't have budgets to fund, and most of the areas where climate change crisis is happening are really remote, and they really require a lot of funding in terms of logistic support for them to get the stories. For many years, they've been getting stories, the negative stories about drought, about conflicts, about all those things. But now, as we are in the decade of climate action, I think organizations like Climate Tracker, all other partners who are in this, the UN agencies that are involved, they need now to get out of the capital cities, from the boardrooms, from the hotels. And if those ones who are saying they are doing work on climate solutions, show us your work, this kind of show the work. So in most cases, we just go and focus on individuals who are trying to make some difference. But the major challenge is issues about budget in the newsroom. And some of the editors also are not interested with some of these stories. They just want to know, to get a story that a number of these people have been killed. And just to sum it up, is climate change, the interdependence of climate change. The hurricanes that are happening in the US, also things that are happening locally are more interdependent. So to like now floods in Mozambique, the typhoons in the Philippines. So those are the effects of climate change. So how are these communities going to rebuild their lives? So issues of financing, climate finance really is required. The policies are there in some of the member states, but the financing issue or their lack of interest in some of these regions, the periphery, you will hear those negative, the perception about the areas. They say they don't make economic sense. Those people are still living a backward life. So those narratives continue getting themselves into the media. So if they ask you, oh, you come from this place, how did you? So those kind of the mentality about, so the climate solution intervention and action that is required from the global partners, from all the African continent people who care about this, it is an issue of trying to get the voices of those vulnerable groups. And climate change is a climate justice issue. It is an applied research issue. It is an ethical issue. It is an issue of activism. And we need to work together collectively so that those affected by these impacts can recover from climate change impacts, and also having some of the policies that can mitigate the disruptive climate events that have been happening for long. And also there's a lot of issues about technologies, the climate technologies like smart agriculture and all that. I'm sorry if there are colleagues who are involved in that. Technology is also expensive. So like, for example, 1 million people who are prone to droughts, how many greenhouses will you buy them? Like one greenhouse costs about, let's say on a very, about $2,500. So how many dollars will you spend to buy greenhouses, to convert them to agriculturalists? But and also there are those notions that some of these communities who are livestock keepers do not know farming. But since in the past 100 years, most of them complemented crop farming with livestock keeping. But to an outsider, to a flying person who comes in, they think that these guys just follow cows. No. They have opportunistic farming that they practice. When it rains, they have, and also they have the way they have the dry season and wet season grazing areas. So those are some of the techniques and some of the context that majority of the journalists and also policymakers don't understand, and also the researchers, because the researcher needs to spend almost 1 year in that place and do all this ethnographic in the sense that they have to live in that environment for an extended period of time so that they can understand. But even if they have lived there for an extended period of time, they are still seen as outsiders. They are still seen by some of the communities who are so much used to humanitarian or development intervention. They give you a wish list. They think that you are coming there to change their lives. So as you stay the first month, second, third month, what they told you in the first month when you landed there, they start changing the conversation. They tell you the truth. Because when they see you, they see anyone outsider, they think you're coming to bring some money or some projects. So, and most of the climate action projects also are timing, the duration of funding, 3 years, if it is long, 5 years. What will you have done within that? Like the first year, some of them do baseline survey for 1 year. The second year is when they start implementing. When now the communities are trying to get some maybe something out of it. The third year, the project is finished. So my challenge is for those ones who care about climate solution or climate action, it's high time we get to involve the vulnerable communities and groups living on the front lines of the climate emergency. Thank you for the time. And I'll be happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you
Back
so
to you,
much.
Joyce.
Thank you so much, Gregory. I think we are short of time, so we are going to just accept one question and then we would have to wrap up. So one question that I think we have here is from Lesotho Mantopi Martina, I think. And she was, I don't know, he or she, I can't really determine, but the question is, yeah,
it's a man. It's a man.
It's a man.
It's a she. A man. It's a madam. They call madam man. Okay, that's fine.
Okay, madam. Okay, so wanted to find out from this community member. She was saying that she wants to find out if there are community journalists or community journalism in Lesotho. She wants to know that if there are journalists within that area that she can collaborate with. So I don't know if the initial community journalist that you mentioned about creating also extends to that region or it's just within Kenya.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Martina, for your question. Okay, this is just a personal initiative. Turkana Garden is a media enterprise and just came out of my passion and care about the region and about the subject of climate change. So for Lesotho, maybe it is something that colleagues who work in that region need to explore. For now, I have no idea about it, but this is a more personal initiative out of passion. And maybe back to Climate Tracker, you can grow another generation of community journalists. And even in Kenya, we don't have enough because of these challenges of financing and all that. So it's more limited to, and maybe it's something that needs to be brought into the center of this conversation about if there are fellowships, if there are funding for local groups or local community media in some of the countries which have the need. Because I know Lesotho has some major challenge of soil erosion and it's a very mountainous region. So for now, maybe it is something we'll consider with other colleagues from the region, from the Southern African region, if there are certain media networks within there which can get involved. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that in general, what I've been getting from this community hangout is that journalists need to collaborate a bit more. We need to put our ears to the ground. We need to go to the grassroots, to be able to get a feel of what these local people are doing and to find out about their solutions. So not to just report on the problems, but then to find out if they have their own local solutions and amplifying those voices so that, people know that, okay, there are indigenous solutions to these climate change problems. So I just want to thank you all once again for joining in on this community hangout. It has been really, really insightful and informational. And before we end, I will encourage everyone to join in on our growing communities. We have a Telegram group, we have a Facebook group, we even have Slack groups. So whichever is comfortable for you, you can join in. And after this community hangout, I'm going to be sending emails to all the registrants so that with all the relevant links so that you guys can join into the communities and have further conversations with me and even engage with other African journalists, because our community is full of journalists from all across the globe who are Africans that are passionate about climate change. So I think that joining our communities will be a very good platform for more collaborations and to create more community journalism if that is what is needed. So before we do that, I would like each and every one of us to turn on our video so that we can take a group photo for the event. Okay, I'm just waiting on a few more people. If you can turn on your videos so that we can just take a brief picture for all the attendants. Okay, thank you so much. We've got the group photo, and thank you so much for joining, and you'll receive emails soon with a recording so that if you missed anything, you can just go back and then review it. And if you have any questions that were not addressed, you can just follow up with the email so that we can send emails to the speakers, and then we can just address any concerns or questions that you may have. But I am so honored. I am thankful that you guys joined in, that you guys are passionate about climate change and you guys want to make a difference. So thank you guys, and I hope to see you in the various communities. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.